Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach was released almost 4 years ago, which I know is just hard to believe since we still have tons of unsolved mysteries with this game. And one of my personal favorite unsolved mysteries that I think will have a major role moving forward with the modern lore is the Blob. The Blob is a mystery that has dozens of different answers that all have their own evidence, and I've even tried to solve the Blob a few times on the channel. But one of the most popular theories in a channel that has had a huge role in trying to solve FNAF and Security Breach, Game Theory, in this infamous PNG that I'm sure you've seen everywhere. Matpat's interpretation of the Blob and of this really random part of Security Breach was one I really enjoyed and one of my favorite theories of his. So after watching Withered Circle's video on Miss Afton and looking back at Game Theory's interpretation, I thought why not do the same with the Blob? So in this video, let's look back at Game Theory's FNAF, the final Security Breach mystery solved, and if it really did solve the Blob. Does this theory still hold up years later after the game's release? Have we found any new evidence for this theory, and what does new lore and games tell us about this theory? Well, my name is Bronze Films, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button, and let's look at what is arguably the franchise's most confusing mystery. For some context, in FNAF Security Breach, Gregory goes to the lowest point in the pizzeria, which was revealed to be the location from FNAF 6. There he finds a sinkhole that goes to an even lower level where he finds the Blob, an amalgamation of animatronic parts, wires, and parts of characters we're all familiar with. The Blob tries to stop Gregory, but he is able to burn trap alongside the Blob and is able to escape the pizzaplex with Glamrock Freddy. The Blob then reappears in a small cameo near the beginning of the Ruin DLC, where he can be seen inside of a hole in the wall before it quickly backs away and becomes out of view, as it will then disappear for the rest of the game. Down in the sinkhole, you can also find a trail of oil left behind from the Blob, as the trail leads to a hole in this wall. This can tell us that the Blob is within the pizzaplex's walls and structure, meaning it's most likely the reason the pizzaplex collapsed against itself was because the Blob would hollow out the foundation with massive tunnels, not because of an earthquake like the newspaper suggested. But what is this amalgamation of different animatronics? Well, it included the FNAF 1 versions of Chica and Bonnie, it included the puppet, Circus Baby, parts of Mangle, and at the head of it all is Funtime Freddy. Now before we look at game theory, some of the other most popular theories include that it's Molten Freddy from FNAF Pizzeria Simulator fused with scraps from the Pizzeria and Pizzaplex, creating a new amalgamation animatronic. But the issue here is that Molten Freddy was burned in the FNAF 6 fire, and that parts like the Funtime animatronics shouldn't technically exist, since by this point in the timeline they were already together as Molten Freddy, and parts from Circus Baby should have been Scrap Baby. Other theories are that it's made up of agony from murdered workers in the Pizzaplex, or that it's simply an entirely new antagonist that for some reason has beef with Burntrap. More recently, theorists like T-Dress have connected this mystery to Secret of the Mimic into the Storyteller tree, suggesting that the Blob is the game's version of Storyteller, or that the Blob is actually F10 and 4 engulfed in wires that are actually controlling and are all over the Pizzaplex, acting as a power source or a hub for the Mimic AI. And the masks could be explained by the FNAF 3 map found in the prototype pizzeria, as this prototype location would be where the Blob is currently residing in. Personally, I suggested that the Blob was made up of the souls of the 7 technicians from Secret of the Mimic who failed to retrieve the Mimic's schematics and were killed by him. The 7 souls would line up with the 7 animatronics making up the Blob. But finally, looking at Game Theory's interpretation of this character that was released only months after this game was released, is that the Blob is made up of animatronic parts from Rockstar and the agony from the animatronics is fueling it. Now I recommend watching the full video if you haven't, or just to rewatch it because it is always fun to look back at these theories before we had Ruin, Help on It 2, and even Secret of the Mimic to help us. Now, Rockstar Row was featured in the opening of Security Breach, and it's a museum featuring all the new artifacts from the franchise. And on the surface, it may just seem like this museum only serves the purpose to hold fun Easter eggs or to show how much time has passed in the timeline. I'm sure many people, including myself, only look through the displays when playing for the very first time, but after that it's easy to just walk past it and completely ignore it. But these displays are important to the Blob, and most importantly, which ones are missing. So first, let's look at each display in Rockstar Row. Going in chronological order, we see FNAF 1 Freddy's foot and bow tie, Freddy's arm and ear, Freddy's mic and its stand, Chica's torso, foot and her infamous cupcake, Bonnie's guitar, and finally we see Foxy's torso and jaw. We then see various posters from FNAF 2 and FNAF 3. We also see these toys from the FNAF 4 bedroom, but we don't see any artifacts from FNAF's sister location. In the corner we can find cardboard cutouts of Dreadbear, Ennard, Shadow Bonnie, Nightmare Balloon Boy, Circus Baby Plush, and Plush Trap. We also see this stage from FNAF Help Wanted, and it's supposed to be a replica of the first FNAF stage. But finally, we see Glamrock Chica's old guitar, this film reel with the label movie on it, and we see this display with what looks like to be animatronic parts and one single eye. But like I said earlier, some of these displays have missing animatronic parts, which is why Game Theory proposed the idea that it's these missing parts that make up the masks and parts of the Blob, and so far it does make sense. We don't know exactly what items were missing, so it's not that hard to imagine that it was the heads, masks, and arms that the Blob would collect to create themselves. A lot of the displays are from the earlier locations, like the FNAF 1 Chica and Bonnie display, which could be exactly where the Blob would collect Chica's and Bonnie's heads and torsos. Or we see a lot of FNAF 2 memorabilia, which is where the Blob could get Mangle's parts and the puppet mask without the tears. Now it is harder to explain Funtime Freddy and Circus Baby since we don't really see a dedicated sister location display. But again, it's easy to say that it could have been any of these displays since we don't know what they look like with every item still there. And if these are just memorabilia and artifacts from past locations, this would explain why we see Funtime Freddy and Circus Baby instead of animatronics like Scrap Baby and Molten Freddy that they would become from sister location to Pizzeria Simulator. This would especially make sense since we saw those animatronics being burned down in the FNAF 6 fire alongside their souls being freed, which brings me to the next major point covered in this video. What's fueling the Blob if it's not these souls? Well, Matpat proposes the idea that because the original animatronics no longer have spirits powering them, the agony they felt while being murdered remains attached to the suits. That's why the Blob would even collect these parts from Rockstar Row, because they would be filled with agony that could then power the Blob, only making itself stronger with each part it collected. It's not collecting spirits, it's collecting agony.
All the pain and suffering of the children from over the years brought together to create one giant monster.
This would also explain why all the eyes for the animatronics and endoskeletons are glowing red. And it's also why the puppet and Circus Baby's eyes aren't glowing red. Like I said earlier, the puppet's mask is missing its tears, signifying that this animatronic's soul is freed, the same reason why Circus Baby's eyes aren't lit up. Elizabeth's soul was also freed during the FNAF 6 fire, and it's only their agony now fueling this monster. Now all of this 100% still holds up with what we know about the Blob and any new lore that was introduced, and the Blob being fueled by agony is still a popular theory, but where that agony came from is what can be different. But for some supporting evidence, which honestly isn't that much since they really did cover all bases, for practical reasons the Blob being able to grab these parts also makes complete sense. Game Theory does cover these oily wires that we see all throughout the Afton boss battle, and even a segment from the story The New Kid from Fazbear Frights, where kids who are exploring an abandoned Freddy's location hear something slithering through the walls, which you could say is something that represents the Blob, a tangle of wires moving around the pizzaplex. And I think we actually see these wires everywhere around the pizzaplex, and I mean everywhere. Up on screen are only a few examples where these wires are just infestating rooms and areas of the pizzaplex, and these wires do definitely look similar to the Blob's wires. So it looks like the core of the Blob is down in the sinkhole where we see the animatronics and endos, while his wires can stretch to and reach any area of the pizzaplex. We can assume he can control these wires just like he does in the sinkhole when trying to grab Gregory. So if these wires are everywhere, then the Blob could have definitely just used one of these wires to sneakily take parts of Rockstar Row going undetected. So I also want to take a look at a duffel bag message that specifically mentions Rockstar Row. When taking a look at the stolen property message, it reads,
"Well, somehow someone broke into a Rockstar Row display case and stole the Wind Up Music Man prototypes. The case was smashed and there's glass on the floor, but no sign of a break-in. Nothing else seems to be missing. I have absolutely no idea how they got into the building, and there's nothing on the security footage. Now what should I do? Should I call the police and report a break-in?"
Now I know we don't see the Wind Up Music Man toys inside of the Blob, and this message could totally be about Vanny, but I think we can use it in the context of the Blob. The Blob would use one of its wires to break the glass of the display case and would then take an animatronic part. And the reason there's nothing on the security cameras is because they wouldn't be able to pick up a wire breaking the display case, or maybe even because the Blob would use another wire to cover or disable the cameras. So the Blob taking parts from Rockstar Row makes that much more sense. In terms of the agony from these items even fueling the Blob and the evidence supporting this, I think it's just the fact that they're even missing. The game could have easily included every animatronic part in the display cases, and in that sense it wouldn't really have changed anything. But because some of them are missing, to me the game would want us to find them and to find a reason for them to be missing. These items having agony or even remnant from past tragedies is a perfect explanation to them being missing, as they could then be used to power or to give life to the Blob, or really to a dozen of different characters depending on how you see it. So as a whole, we have a pretty solid theory here. Now we just need to look at new games to see if it holds up, since this was released before Ruin and every project that followed. At the time this theory was released, we only had a teaser poster for Ruin, and from this, Game Theory theorized that the red eyes and wires seen on the poster would be the Blob returning once more as the main antagonist. They believe that the ruined pizzaplex was a result of the burn trap ending where the pizzaplex collapsed on itself due to the fire, and that because the Blob took burn trap with him, Afton and the agony of this animatronic would fuse together, creating an entirely new antagonist. And this was honestly something I feel like most of us believed in until Ruin was ultimately released. Alright, now the Mimic and the direction the Ruin DLC went towards wasn't really something any of us were expecting. But ultimately it was widely well received, and of course the Mimic has continued to be explored as the main antagonist with each new game's release, like a whole dedicated origin game, Secret of the Mimic. But that meant that Game Theory and really most of the community at the time weren't able to predict the Ruin DLC. For one, the Burn Trap ending wasn't even canon, as we learned that the Princess Quest ending was. We saw the princesses sort through the arcade machine in Vanny's room, and the other endings that weren't canon would receive a comic book style drawing that was made by Gregory to say they're not canon, which of course included the Burn Trap ending, and Burn Trap wasn't even in Ruin at all. Now you could argue that he's the Mimic or that he's somewhere else in the sinkhole, but without a definitive answer, he was just kinda pushed to the side. But what about the Blob? Well, Game Theory was right about the Blob. He does actually show up in Ruin, just for a slight second, and then we never see him again. Rockstar Row is also just something we don't really see, as this area is blocked off, so we can't really look here for evidence. But with the Blob itself, there are some interesting details worth mentioning. Earlier I said that all the eyes from the animatronics and the Blob were glowing red, telling us that it's being fueled by agony. But here the Blob's eyes aren't glowing red any longer, and they don't actually have any glow to them. We don't see all of the animatronics that are supposed to be in the Blob, since the player is only supposed to see the head, but we do see Bonnie and Circus Baby. Like in Security Breach, Circus Baby's eyes are still not lit up, but Bonnie's still are. Now I do want to say that it looks like the Blob no longer has any agony attached to it. Although we do see Bonnie's eyes lit up, this is most likely because they took the model from Security Breach and used what they needed, so Circus Baby and Bonnie look exactly how they did in Security Breach. But with Funtime Freddy, who again is the part the players were supposed to see, their eyes aren't lit up, and if we were supposed to see the full model, I'm sure all of the eyes of the animatronics would no longer be lit up. So what does this mean? Well, saying that Burn Trap is Afton here, it makes sense that the agony fueling the Blob would be the strongest around the thing that inflicted the agony onto them. That's why they're trying to stop Burn Trap, and that's why when they're close to him, all of their eyes are lit up. And in Ruin, with whatever happened to Burn Trap, the Blob is no longer near him, nor would they have any agony towards him. It's also possible that the Blob would just want to escape the sinkhole after being stuck down there for some period of time. So after escaping, it would then lose its agony and would now roam the walls of the pizzaplex. But if this is the case, then what's fueling it? Well, it could be anything from remnant or possession from souls we're not aware of. I personally think that it's just the remnant from these artifacts that is now fueling the Blob, but this just brings up yet another question. Now what? If Afton is defeated, what is the Blob's purpose? Without agony, what is the Blob? Well, this is harder to say, and unfortunately none of the games released after Ruin can even help. In FNAF Help 1 and 2, the Blob was supposed to make an appearance in the Fizzy Faz minigames, but it was ultimately cut, and we don't really know what they would have looked like. And of course, with Secret of the Mimic, although we can use pieces of this game's lore to fill in gaps of the Blob's story, ultimately they're not concrete answers, and it doesn't really seem like we'll ever get one. Or at least that's what I would be saying if our last hope didn't lie with the next possible game, FNAF Abyss. I already made a video going over all the teasers and information for this next possible FNAF game that many are labeling as Abyss. It's believed that it will pick up right after the events of Ruin, with Cassie surviving the elevator fall and trying to get out of the pizzaplex one last time. So if we're revisiting the Ruin pizzaplex, then I think we can say for almost certain that the Blob has to make an appearance. We can assume that this will be one of the last games in the Mimic arc, or maybe even the last game centered around the pizzaplex. We'll definitely see the Mimic, and maybe even Burn Trap if he really is separate from the Mimic, so why wouldn't we see the Blob as a secondary antagonist? Or since he doesn't seem to be powered by agony anymore, he could be a friend to Cassie, helping her escape so he could also ultimately be free. I imagine a game mechanic where we can almost summon the Blob to move obstacles or to just help us find a way out. But this is all just speculation, and really it's our last chance to get more information on this character. But to end the video, I do want to look back at Game Theory's video and on what Matpat said about a solution to stop the Blob. He goes over how in the Fazbear Fright novels, the solution is to see in people's memories and to trap them in those memories. This might seem like it doesn't correlate with any of the games, but we have actually gotten a few tie-ins to memories. The best way to look at it is with FNAF Help 1 and 2, where you collect memory plushies of the missing children incident that allows you to complete the secret ending, where you then place these plushies onto graves, lighting them. And in Ruin, I also think we saw some sort of memory. In the sad ending where Cassie wears the Vanny mask in front of this Fredbear cardboard cutout, she sees Gregory, Helpy, and Vanessa happily on the infamous ending hillside as they all tell her they're safe. Now I know this isn't technically a memory as it's more of a false reality, but I think it could have been made from a memory where Cassie and Gregory were playing on a hillside, a memory that was one of Cassie's favorite that the Vanny mask would then recreate. And this is how I think they could stop the Blob if needed, by somehow trapping the Blob in a fake reality, never truly letting it escape. And this memory could be the way of telling us who the Blob really is and where the agony that's fueling it came from, but this is all just a theory.
A game theory! Thanks for watching.
With that said, I hope you all enjoyed this video where we look back at Game Theory's interpretation of the Blob to see if they truly did solve this character. So did they? Well, I think they did. I think they have one of the most solid interpretations that can still hold up to this day even with all the new lore revealed. So what do you guys think? Did Game Theory solve the Blob? Let me know if I should make more of these videos looking back at Game Theory's videos, as it was a lot of fun looking back at older interpretations, and you never know, 4 years from now we could be looking back at Tom's game theories to see if he solved the game like Secret of the Mimic. So please consider hitting that like and subscribe subscribe button, and thank you all so much for watching.